Detroit, Michigan, December 1941. The air is thick with frost and steel dust. Inside a cavernous factory, the clang of hammers echoes like
Tanks move up on the flank.
Sparks burst from the floor where welders crouch beside sheets of raw armor plate. The smell of oil and iron fills every breath. Men who once built convertibles now bend over blueprints for something entirely different. A machine meant not for roads, but for war. On the factory floor stands a half-finished tank, its treads resting on wooden blocks. A worker wipes his brow, staring at the strange new shape. Above them, an engineer in a dark coat watches silently. His name is William S. Knudsen, an immigrant who once built America's cars, now charged with building its weapons. Behind him, the massive clock on the wall ticks toward midnight. Across the radio, President Roosevelt's voice declares the nation at war. The challenge is impossible. Turn peacetime industry into the greatest war machine in human history. And in Knudsen's hand, a single sheet of paper, a blueprint that could make tanks roll off assembly lines like cars. But first, he has to make the world believe it can be done. The world was burning long before America entered the war. In September 1939, Nazi Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg across Poland, a thunderous new kind of warfare. Armored divisions, radio-coordinated and fueled by precision logistics, tore through defenses with terrifying speed. Europe's old armies, still trained in the slow traditions of trench warfare, crumbled before steel and fire. By the summer of 1940, France had fallen in just 6 weeks. Britain stood alone, her cities bombed nightly by the Luftwaffe. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched, powerful but unprepared. Its army ranked 18th in the world, behind Romania's. Its armored force consisted of little more than a few hundred outdated tanks, most built in the 1920s. Factories hummed with the rhythm of peace. Ford was still producing sedans. General Motors was focused on Buicks and Chevrolets. The idea of war production on a continental scale seemed far away, even absurd. America's faith rested in its oceans, not in its arsenals. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw further. As Europe collapsed, he knew the industrial power of the United States might soon be all that stood between democracy and darkness. He called for an arsenal of democracy, but even he did not yet know how that arsenal would be built. The problem was simple and impossible at once: how to convert an economy of consumers into an economy of soldiers, without destroying it in the process. Enter William Cygnus Knudsen. Born in Copenhagen in 1879, Knudsen arrived in America with little more than mechanical skill and ambition. He began as a bicycle repairman in Buffalo, New York. By 1911, he was hired by Ford Motor Company, a new industry with new ideas. Henry Ford's moving assembly line revolutionized production. Knudsen learned fast. He became the quiet master of logistics, the man who could take chaos and turn it into rhythm. By the 1920s, Knudsen was the president of General Motors, overseeing an empire of cars, trucks, and parts built with efficiency unmatched anywhere in the world. He was not a dreamer, he was an organizer, calm, methodical, precise. When the war began, Roosevelt's advisors argued about strategy and diplomacy. But one voice in Washington asked a different question: who can build the tools? The answer, whispered through industrial circles, was Knudsen. In 1940, Roosevelt summoned him to the White House. The conversation was brief. America was still neutral, but the president spoke of the storm gathering across the oceans. "Bill, we're going to need to build planes and tanks faster than the world has ever imagined." Knudsen accepted the call and resigned from a $200,000 a year position to work for the U.S. government for a single dollar. He walked into a system that didn't yet exist. There was no coordinated defense industry, no standardization, no central authority over production. The military wanted weapons, but every branch wanted them built differently. The Army demanded control. The Navy distrusted outsiders. The auto industry, meanwhile, resisted abandoning consumer markets. And yet Knudsen believed he could bridge them all. He saw factories not as rigid structures, but as systems. If each part could be aligned, production could flow, the same way cars had once rolled off Detroit's lines. But the challenge went beyond machines. America's workforce was untrained in heavy military manufacturing. Tooling equipment was scarce. Blueprints were inconsistent, often hand-drawn and changed mid-production. Even raw materials, steel, copper, rubber, were rationed by politics rather than logic. Knudsen began traveling, meeting with industrialists, machinists, and generals. He listened, observed, calculated. At night, he filled notebooks with flow diagrams and production sequences. What he envisioned bordered on madness. To apply the principles of automobile assembly to the instruments of war, tanks, planes, jeeps, guns, everything. Each weapon would become a product, each product a system, each system a part of a greater whole. It was efficiency as strategy, manufacturing as warfare. Yet in 1940, few believed it could be done. Army officers dismissed the idea, arguing that tanks were too complex to be built like cars. Welders and machinists were already stretched thin, and Henry Ford himself, though intrigued, refused to build weapons for a war America had not yet entered. But history was moving faster than politics. By mid-1941, Roosevelt's Lend-Lease policy sent American-made weapons to Britain and the Soviet Union. The tide of demand became a flood, and in Knudsen's blueprint, that impossible idea began to take form in steel and smoke. He called it the synchronization of production. Others would later call it industrial warfare. Soon, America's automakers would trade chrome for armor plate, paint booths for welding bays, assembly lines for tank tracks. The transformation was beginning, and the world was about to see how an engineer's mind could fight a war.
By the summer of 1941, the foundations of America's wartime industry were trembling into place, but only barely. The military demanded tanks by the thousands, aircraft by the tens of thousands, and trucks by the hundreds of thousands. Yet there were no factories capable of such output, no assembly systems suited to the scale of war now unfolding overseas. Knudsen, recently appointed as Director of Production under the newly formed Office of Production Management, understood the scale of the challenge better than anyone. He had built cars, but tanks were a different beast altogether. They required precision machining, ballistic-grade armor, specialized engines, and massive forgings. Every part had to fit perfectly, even under battlefield punishment. The existing manufacturers, small firms like American Locomotive, Baldwin, and Rock Island Arsenal, could only produce tanks in the dozens. Their work was skilled but slow, more craft than industry. Knudsen's mission was to transform that craft into a continuous process, one that could run without stopping. He began not with steel, but with structure. The auto industry, he argued, was America's hidden army. Its supply chain stretched across the continent, a living web of steel mills, foundries, and tool makers. If properly aligned, it could turn blueprints into rolling armor faster than any arsenal in Europe. But convincing Detroit's titans was another matter. Henry Ford, though a mechanical genius, despised government interference. He distrusted Roosevelt and refused to build weapons as long as the U.S. remained neutral. Ford's son, Edsel, more pragmatic and patriotic, saw things differently. Together with Knudsen, he began quietly retooling Ford's vast River Rouge plant for war work, starting with aircraft engines and scout vehicles. At Chrysler, CEO K.T. Keller offered another proposal. If the military could agree on a standard tank design, Chrysler could build a factory dedicated entirely to its production. The concept was radical, a tank plant operating like an auto line. The Army's Ordnance Department, long bound by conservative traditions, hesitated. Tanks, they argued, were too intricate, too unpredictable. No machine of war could be built like a Ford sedan. But Knudsen pushed relentlessly. Give them one design, he insisted, and they'll build you 1,000. Still, the problem of design itself was unresolved. American tanks lagged behind German panzers in both armor and firepower. The early M2 medium tank was obsolete before it left the factory floor. Knudsen pressed the Army's engineers for a single, modern, standardized model, a weapon that could be mass-produced without endless revisions. What emerged after months of negotiation was the M3 Lee, and soon after, its successor, the M4 Sherman. Neither would match the German Tiger in brute strength, but that was never the point. Knudsen's genius lay in quantity over perfection. A tank that was good enough, if produced in overwhelming numbers, could win wars where precision alone could not. By late 1941, as Japanese forces prepared their strike across the Pacific, Knudsen's grand design was finally accepted. The Detroit Tank Arsenal was commissioned, to be built by Chrysler, supervised by Knudsen's team, and supported by hundreds of subcontractors nationwide. The scale was staggering. A plant covering nearly 1 million square feet, filled with cranes, presses, welders, and the rhythmic heartbeat of assembly lines. Its sole purpose was to turn raw steel into tanks at an industrial tempo the world had never seen. Yet, as America's entry into war loomed, the obstacles remained immense. Machine tools were in short supply, rail systems were clogged, workers were inexperienced, farmers, mechanics, even housewives now trained for precision tasks. Every day brought new shortages, new delays. Then came December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The illusion of distance vanished overnight. America was at war. Factories that had hesitated now roared to life. The auto executives who once doubted now raced to fulfill contracts. Every foundry, every mill, every workshop became part of a national symphony of production. Knudsen, now appointed lieutenant general under the new War Department, stood at the center of it all, a civilian engineer in uniform overseeing the greatest mobilization of industrial power in human history. He once said quietly to a colleague, "We are not building tanks, we are building time." For every hour saved in production, another life might be spared on the battlefield. And so, as smoke rose from Detroit's furnaces and steel flowed into armor plates, the impossible blueprint was no longer just an idea. It was becoming real. A mechanical army born from the heartbeat of America's factories. And soon, the world would see it move.
The human angle. The engineer who built an army. William S. Knudsen never saw himself as a hero. He wasn't a general, a politician, or a man who sought the spotlight. He was a builder, shaped by the rhythm of machines and the logic of process. In the early days of America's mobilization, he worked 14-hour days, touring factories from Buffalo to St. Louis, sleeping on trains, and scribbling production notes by lamplight. His hands shook from exhaustion, but his focus never wavered. "Keep it simple," he told plant managers. "If you can't build one, you can't build 1,000. He had a gift for persuasion, not through rhetoric, but through understanding. He spoke to businessmen in the language of profit, to workers in the language of pride, and to generals in the language of results. He listened more than he talked, and in a time when egos collided at every table, that made him indispensable. His calm contrasted with the chaos of Washington.
Committees debated policy, while Knudsen stood in greasy overalls, timing assembly lines with a stopwatch. He believed in results, not speeches. He knew that every machine delayed meant a soldier left unprotected. He also knew the power of humility. When he entered the War Department as a civilian, officers in crisp uniforms doubted him. Some called him the car salesman in khaki. But soon they saw what he could do. Under his guidance, production timelines shrank from months to weeks. Factories that once made bumpers now turned out gun mounts. Men who had never touched a wrench were trained to fit armor plates with millimeter precision. Knudsen didn't invent the tank, but he invented a way to make them, predictably, repeatably, relentlessly. That, more than any single battle, would define America's war. The industrial angle. Detroit becomes a battlefield. The skyline of Detroit changed almost overnight. Where neon signs sold convertibles and chrome, black smoke now rose from tank factories. The city's heartbeat shifted from consumer comfort to total war. At the Detroit Tank Arsenal, Chrysler engineers built an entire city within a city. Rail yards, testing grounds, machine shops, dormitories, cafeterias, even their own police force. Every day, trains arrived loaded with steel from Pittsburgh, rubber from Akron, copper from the Rockies, the raw materials of victory. Inside, the line never stopped. Day and night, the factory echoed with the clang of presses and the shriek of grinders. Sparks from welders rained like fireworks across the concrete. Conveyor belts carried tank hulls the length of football fields. Each worker specialized in one motion: drilling, riveting, bolting, welding, repeated hundreds of times a day. Efficiency was the weapon. Every second mattered. Chrysler engineers redesigned the workflow weekly, shaving minutes off assembly times. They color-coded tools, simplified blueprints, and invented jigs that allowed unskilled laborers to work with precision. By the spring of 1942, the arsenal turned out a completed M3 every few hours. By the end of the year, the improved M4 Sherman was rolling off the line like clockwork. But it wasn't just Chrysler. Across the Midwest, Ford, GM, and hundreds of subcontractors joined the industrial offensive. Ford's Willow Run plant, built to produce B-24 bombers, became a symbol of what Knudsen had envisioned: an assembly line that could produce a 4-engine bomber every hour. The American home front had become a machine unlike any other in history. Every worker was a cog in the arsenal of democracy. Yet amid the strain of steel and fire, the intensity was immense. Labor shortages, rationing, and grueling shifts tested morale. Women filled the gaps. Rosie the riveters with scarves tied tight against the smoke, their faces lit by the glow of molten metal. For them, production wasn't just duty. It was contribution, a way to fight from the factory floor. Detroit no longer just built cars. It built power. The technological angle. The tank built for mass production. The M4 Sherman was not the best tank in the war. It was not the strongest, nor the most heavily armored. But it was the right tank, designed to be built, repaired, and replaced at speed. Early tank models like the M2 and M3 were too complex for mass production. They relied on riveted armor and hand-fitted components. Knudsen's teams, working with Chrysler engineers and the Army's Ordnance Bureau, changed that. They redesigned the hull for welded construction, faster, cheaper, stronger. They standardized components so that parts from one factory could fit those from another. It was mechanical choreography on a national scale. The Sherman's engine came from aircraft design, a powerful radial engine adapted from aviation stock. Its suspension was rugged, forgiving under mud and desert sand alike. Its armor was sloped, improving protection without adding weight. But its true strength was in simplicity. Crews could repair a Sherman in the field with basic tools. Damaged tanks could be stripped for parts and rebuilt. In battle, this meant that while Germany's Panthers and Tigers broke down or waited weeks for replacement components, American divisions rolled forward with steady mechanical consistency. Knudsen's doctrine was clear. Better 1,000 good tanks today than 100 perfect ones next year. And by the time America's armies reached North Africa, that philosophy would be tested in fire. The assembly lines were running. The tanks were moving. The question was, would they be enough?
The leadership angle, the engineer, and the generals. War is rarely won by soldiers alone. It takes leaders, and sometimes they wear no medals. William Knudsen's battlefield was made of steel and silence. His opponents were not enemy armies, but inefficiency, rivalry, and doubt. Yet to make his vision real, he had to work with, and often against, the most powerful men in Washington. President Roosevelt trusted him, but kept him under pressure. The military respected his production miracles, but resented his independence. Business leaders admired him, but feared government control. Between them all, Knudsen became the quiet bridge, the one man who could speak every language of power. In 1942, Roosevelt reorganized the entire war economy under the War Production Board, naming Donald Nelson as chairman and Knudsen as his deputy. The relationship was uneasy. Nelson was a bureaucrat, Knudsen a doer. Meetings often turned into shouting matches, but when factories stalled, it was Knudsen who climbed aboard trains and fixed the problem in person. He inspired by example, not decree. When a plant in Illinois struggled to meet its quota, Knudsen arrived unannounced, sleeves rolled up, stopwatch in hand. Within hours, he'd traced the bottleneck to a simple layout flaw, machines spaced too far apart. He ordered the lines moved 6 feet closer. Output rose 20% overnight. His leadership was rooted in respect. He trusted ordinary workers with extraordinary tasks. "They'll do it," he said, "if you give them a reason." That belief, that a nation's strength was found in its people, became the moral core of America's wartime industry. Even generals, hardened by command, came to rely on the man who never carried a weapon. They saw in Knudsen the rarest kind of leader, one who led not for glory, but for results. The enemy angle, Germany's precision versus America's scale. While America was building a new kind of war machine, Germany was refining an old one. The Wehrmacht's tanks, the Panzer III, Panzer IV, and later the Tiger, were marvels of engineering. Each was handcrafted, assembled with obsessive precision. Their armor was thick, their guns deadly, their mechanisms intricate. In mechanical quality, they were superior to anything rolling out of Detroit. But Germany's strength was also its weakness. Each tank required weeks of skilled labor. Each part demanded expert fitting. Factories depended on small workshops and limited raw materials. As the war dragged on, German production slowed even as demand skyrocketed. Allied bombers shattered supply chains. Skilled machinists were drafted to the front. By 1943, German tank output had peaked at roughly 6,000 per year. The United States, by contrast, was building nearly 50,000 Shermans annually. The difference was philosophical as much as industrial. German engineers sought perfection. American engineers sought replication. Knudsen understood what Hitler's generals did not, that modern war was not won by quality alone, but by momentum. A Sherman might be destroyed in battle, but another would take its place within weeks. A Tiger might kill 5 Shermans, but if 10 arrived the next day, the outcome was inevitable. Behind every American tank was not just a factory, but a network. Thousands of subcontractors, coordinated suppliers, and transport lines running day and night. It was a war fought by railroads, cranes, blueprints, and assembly lines. When Allied forces landed in North Africa and later in Normandy, they brought with them the living proof of Knudsen's blueprint, industrial power as weaponized strategy. The moral and strategic angle, turning a nation into a war machine. The transformation of America's industry was not without cost. In 1942, civilian car production ceased entirely. No new automobiles rolled out of Detroit for the duration of the war. Factories that once symbolized progress now produced destruction. Billboards promoting road trips and home comforts were replaced by war bond posters and rationing charts. Gasoline, rubber, and metal were tightly controlled. Knudsen often spoke of efficiency, but privately he understood the moral weight of what he was doing. "We're building death," one worker said to him at the River Rouge plant. He paused, then replied softly, "We're building freedom." That paradox defined the home front. Women left homes for factories. Farmers' sons became machinists. Cities filled with the smoke of creation and the silence of loss. The assembly line, once the symbol of consumer abundance, had become a symbol of collective sacrifice. Every tank rolling out of the Detroit arsenal carried with it not just armor and ammunition, but the labor of thousands who would never see the front lines. It was a shared act of defense, a nation turning its talent toward survival. Strategically, Knudsen's approach changed how wars were fought. Before him, armies planned around supply. After him, supply created the army. Logistics became doctrine. Industrial might became military power. By 1943, America's factories were producing more material than all the Axis nations combined. It was no longer a war of tactics. It was a war of output. And it was Knudsen's invisible blueprint, his impossible idea, that made it so. The tanks were ready, the factories were humming, the enemy was waiting. Now came the test, when theory would meet fire on the battlefield.
Detroit, Michigan, spring 1942. The great factory doors of the Detroit tank arsenal opened for the first time. Outside, rows of workers gathered beneath a rising cloud of smoke. Inside, under steel rafters and floodlights, the first completed M3 Lee rumbled forward, its treads grinding across the concrete floor, its engine echoing through the hall like the growl of an awakening giant. It had taken just 9 months to build the plant from empty ground to full operation, a record that defied every prediction. When Chrysler's engineers were first handed the contract, they were told it would take 2 years. Knudsen had smiled, pointed to his charts, and said quietly, "You'll have it in 9 months." He was right. The arsenal stretched nearly half a mile long, a cathedral of industry. Steel ingots entered one end, armored vehicles emerged from the other. Cranes glided above like iron birds, lifting turret assemblies onto hulls. Conveyor belts carried engines the size of small cars. Each tank passed through 23 stages of assembly: welding, machining, painting, inspection, before rolling out into the sunlight, ready for war. But success came with pain. The early tanks broke down frequently. Welds cracked, transmissions jammed, engines overheated. The M3's tall, awkward profile made it an easy target. Reports from training grounds were grim. Knudsen refused to slow down. "We'll fix it in motion," he told the engineers. And so they did, redesigning, retooling, replacing parts even as production accelerated. Each flaw became an improvement, each setback a lesson. By the summer of 1942, the next generation, the M4 Sherman, began to take shape. It was lower, sturdier, and easier to produce. Chrysler's engineers reworked the blueprints so that parts could be interchanged between factories.
Standardization became the heart of the system. At the peak of the shift, more than 12,000 workers filled the arsenal, divided into 3 teams rotating day and night. The factory never slept. Trains rattled in and out, carrying tanks west toward the ports. Mechanics performed final checks under floodlights. Foremen carried clipboards soaked with sweat and oil. The sound was unending, the rhythmic clang of production, the heartbeat of America's new army. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Allies were desperate. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps swept across the desert, their panzers outmatching British armor. The tide of war seemed irreversible. London pleaded for reinforcements. Knudsen's machines arrived just in time. In the fall of 1942, the first convoys carrying Detroit-built Shermans reached the docks of Egypt. The tanks rolled off the ships onto the scorching sands, their olive-drab paint still smelling of factory lacquer. British crews climbed aboard and marveled at their reliability. Engines roared to life after weeks at sea. Tracks bit into the desert. At El Alamein, Montgomery's 8th Army unleashed them against Rommel's lines. The Shermans moved with mechanical precision, their engines humming like a symphony of power. For the first time, Allied armor could match the enemy in mobility and coordination. Knudsen watched the news in silence. He never spoke publicly of that victory, but those who worked with him said he smiled quietly that night. The blueprint had reached the battlefield, and it worked. Back home, the arsenal increased its pace. The phrase Knudsen time entered the vocabulary of industry, meaning to deliver faster than possible. Workers hung signs reading, "Hitler hates this factory." In less than 2 years, Detroit had built more tanks than Germany had produced since 1939. But Knudsen's work was far from over. The demands from Washington multiplied daily. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, aircraft. The military wanted everything, and they wanted it yesterday. The machine that he had built now had to feed an entire global war. Every delay cost lives. Every success saved them. He carried that weight in silence. In 1943, while visiting the arsenal, Knudsen paused beside the line as a newly completed Sherman rolled past. A worker, covered in soot, called out, "You think these will win it, Mr. Knudsen?" He replied without turning his head, "They'll get us there." He was right again. The tanks from Detroit would not end the war, but they would carry the Allies across 2 continents to finish it. And as the desert dust settled, another storm was forming, one that would test Knudsen's system and the endurance of every man and woman who powered it. 1943. The arsenal of democracy at full roar. In cities across America, night was no longer dark. The glow of factories burned through the skyline. Furnaces, welding torches, and smokestacks lit like constellations of steel. The United States had become a nation of forges, and William Knudsen stood at its center, guiding the storm he had created. At the Detroit tank arsenal, the rhythm never stopped. 1 tank every 30 minutes. Every day, more than 200 tanks rolled off the line. Trains waited in long rows outside, their flat cars stretching toward the horizon. When the factory siren sounded, it didn't mark an end, only the beginning of another shift. By mid-1943, production had reached its zenith. Chrysler had perfected the Sherman's workflow. Armor plates arrived pre-cut, engines pre-assembled, bolts and rivets packed in color-coded containers. Even the paint was standardized, applied in one continuous pass, saving minutes that added up to days. Knudsen's blueprint, once dismissed as fantasy, had become doctrine. His system was now studied by generals, economists, and factory chiefs around the world. The War Production Board called it the Knudsen method. Ford called it military mass production. The Army called it salvation. But success came at a human cost. The relentless pace of work strained everyone involved. Accidents were frequent. Sleep was rare. The heat from the furnaces made the air shimmer. Many workers labored 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, earning barely enough to live on, but proud of what they built. "We're winning it right here," they'd say, pointing to the tanks. Knudsen rarely rested. He traveled from plant to plant, from aircraft factories in California to shipyards in New Jersey, solving problems, streamlining systems, enforcing quality. His notebooks filled with calculations and sketches. He seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere, a ghost moving through the arteries of America's war machine. And the results spoke for themselves. By the end of 1943, America's factories had produced more than 29,000 Sherman tanks, 86,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 250,000 military vehicles of all types. No nation in history had ever matched such output. On the battlefields, that difference was beginning to tell. In Tunisia, Shermans overwhelmed Rommel's remaining armor. In Sicily, they pushed through hills and narrow streets once thought impassable. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, entire armored divisions advanced on Shermans built in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago, a steel tide rolling east. Knudsen's machines became symbols of persistence. Soldiers trusted them not because they were perfect, but because they were always there. When one was destroyed, another replaced it. When one bogged down, 2 more pulled it free. That reliability, born from standardization and mass production, turned the tide of ground warfare. Even the Germans began to notice. Reports from the front described the endless appearance of new American tanks. "They just keep coming." That phrase became the grim refrain of Axis commanders. But for Knudsen, triumph was shadowed by exhaustion. Years of unbroken work had worn him down. His hair had turned white. His hands trembled with fatigue. He refused to slow down until Roosevelt himself intervened. "Bill," the president said, "you've done enough." In 1944, Knudsen quietly retired from his wartime post. He returned to private life with little ceremony. No parade, no medals, just a handshake and a simple letter of thanks. Yet behind him, the system he had built continued to roar, a living legacy of efficiency and willpower. That same year, the arsenal of democracy reached its absolute peak. In 12 months, America produced more tanks, planes, and ships than all its enemies combined. For the first time in the war, the Allies possessed not only superior numbers, but unstoppable supply. Logistics became destiny. And though the world would remember the generals, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Patton, it was Knudsen's invisible army of builders, welders, and machinists who had given them the tools to win. When the tide finally turned at Normandy, when Allied tanks broke through at St. Lo and raced toward Paris, many of those machines still bore the small stamped letters DTA, Detroit Tank Arsenal, a silent tribute to the blueprint that made them possible. In those final months, as Knudsen watched from afar, the noise of industry began to fade. The lines still ran, but the outcome was now certain. The impossible had been done. The man who once built Buicks had built victory. But with peace on the horizon, another question loomed. What would happen to the giant he had unleashed when the guns went silent? August 1945. The guns finally fell silent. The war that had consumed continents ended with a thunderclap over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Across the Pacific and Atlantic, the factories that had fueled the greatest industrial surge in human history began to slow. Conveyor belts emptied, workers laid down their tools, the roar of the arsenal of democracy faded into memory. For William Knudsen, it was the end of an era and the beginning of another reckoning. He had not stood on battlefields, yet his fingerprints were on every one of them. From the dunes of El Alamein to the forests of Normandy, his machines had carried soldiers, pulled artillery, and broken through fortifications once thought impenetrable. His methods, standardized, synchronized, unstoppable, had rewritten the very nature of warfare. In the first full accounting after victory, the numbers were staggering. Between 1940 and 1945, American industry produced 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 300,000 aircraft, and over 2.3 million trucks and jeeps. The Detroit tank arsenal alone had built nearly 25,000 tanks, more than the combined output of Germany's entire wartime armored production in its first 4 years. The blueprint had worked, beyond even Knudsen's imagination. But as the last tank rolled out of the factory gates, a new anxiety settled over Detroit. What happens when an economy built for war has to build for peace? The government began canceling defense contracts by the thousands. The military no longer needed an army of machines, it needed stability, consumer goods, and housing for returning soldiers. Workers feared layoffs. Managers worried that entire plants would close. The tank lines that had once symbolized triumph now stood silent, their assembly halls echoing with the ghosts of effort. Knudsen saw it coming. Even before victory was declared, he warned Washington, "You can't stop this machine overnight. You must steer it, or it will stop itself." In speeches to industrial groups, he urged a gradual transition. Convert war plants into civilian manufacturers, retrain workers, and adapt the same systems that built tanks to build tractors, trucks, and cars. In many cases, that's exactly what happened. The Detroit arsenal shifted briefly to civilian construction machinery. Willow Run switched from bombers to automobiles. The post-war boom, the rise of suburban America, the explosion of consumer manufacturing, all grew from the roots Knudsen had planted in those desperate war years. Yet while the nation celebrated peace, few remembered the man who had made its arsenal possible. Generals and politicians received parades, medals, and headlines. Knudsen, always private, quietly returned to Detroit, serving as an advisor to industry and government. His name faded from the front pages, but his legacy lived in every factory whistle, every moving line, every mechanic who understood that production could be a kind of power. The human side of that legacy was enormous. Wartime production had lifted millions out of poverty, given women a place in the industrial workforce, and reshaped American identity. The assembly line, once a symbol of monotony, became a badge of patriotism. But the moral weight remained. Knudsen knew what those machines had done. He had built not just the means to defend freedom, but also the means to destroy. Like the atomic scientists at Los Alamos, he carried that quiet burden, the knowledge that human genius could both protect and annihilate. He once told a colleague, "It's not the machines I remember, it's the people who made them. We asked them to build faster, harder, longer, and they did." The arsenal of democracy had been more than steel and smoke. It was a nation discovering its power and the cost of wielding it. And as peace settled over the world, the same question echoed through every factory that had once built for war. What do we build next?
In the months after victory, the American industrial landscape stood transformed.
The same plants that once turned out tanks and bombers now produced tractors, refrigerators, and automobiles. Civilian production returned with a roar, powered by the same efficiency Knudsen had refined in war. What had been the arsenal of democracy became the engine of prosperity. The techniques of standardization, modular construction, and streamlined logistics now drove an unprecedented post-war boom. Families who had once rationed gasoline now drove new Chevrolets. Aircraft plants shifted to commercial aviation. Factories that once forged gun barrels now extruded pipes and washing machines. Knudsen's vision, born of necessity, had become a permanent feature of modern life. Yet, for all his success, the man himself slipped into quiet anonymity. He declined interviews, refused public honors, and avoided politics. When asked about his wartime service, he said only, "I was just doing my job." In 1944, he had become the first civilian in American history to be commissioned a lieutenant general for his contribution to the war effort. It was an extraordinary gesture, an acknowledgement that leadership could take many forms, not all of them carried out on the battlefield. But even with that distinction, Knudsen faded from public view. The generals whose tanks he had built became legends. Eisenhower wrote memoirs, Patton was immortalized in film, but the engineer who had armed them remained a quiet figure in the background, his name rarely mentioned in classrooms or documentaries. Still, the legacy endured, quietly, persistently. Every major industrial project that followed, from the interstate highway system to the space race, owed something to Knudsen's wartime model. His synchronization of production became the foundation for systems engineering, logistics management, and just-in-time manufacturing. Even beyond Europe, his influence spread. Europe's post-war reconstruction borrowed heavily from his principles. Japan's industrial rebirth, epitomized by Toyota's efficiency model, echoed the lessons of Knudsen's wartime coordination. The same blueprint that once built tanks now built peace. But history is never simple. Critics later questioned the cost of total mobilization, the blurring of lines between civilian and military life, the moral ease with which a society could turn its creative genius toward destruction. The war had proven that production itself could become a weapon, and that once unleashed, such power would forever change the relationship between industry and war. Knudsen, in his final years, reflected on that paradox. He spent his retirement advising manufacturers on peacetime efficiency, urging them to focus on craftsmanship and human welfare rather than volume. "Speed is a tool, not a purpose," he wrote in one of his final essays. He died in 1948 at the age of 69, quietly, without ceremony, surrounded by his family. The New York Times published a modest obituary. Few outside the industrial world noticed, but within the factories he had built, among the men and women who had turned his impossible dream into reality, his memory endured. One worker from the Detroit arsenal later said, "We never saw the front, but we felt like we fought beside him. He gave us something to believe in, that what we made mattered." In that sense, William Knudsen's victory was not just in numbers, but in meaning. He had proven that leadership could exist without orders, that wars could be fought with ideas as surely as with bullets. His blueprint had reshaped the modern world, and though his name faded, his system never stopped running. Even today, when assembly lines hum and robotic arms weld steel with unerring rhythm, they echo his design, the invisible inheritance of a man who once turned an automobile nation into the greatest war machine in history. And as the last sparks of wartime industry cooled into the quiet hum of peace, one truth remained. Knudsen's impossible blueprint had done more than win a war. It had redefined how humanity builds its future.
History often remembers the battles, the thunder of guns, the flags raised over ruined cities. But behind every victory lies another kind of heroism, the quiet genius that builds the means to fight. William S. Knudsen never fired a shot, yet he armed an entire world. His blueprint, conceived in the cold halls of Detroit's factories, transformed the United States from a scattered collection of companies into a coordinated force of production unmatched in history. What he achieved was more than technical. It was philosophical. He proved that war could be fought not only with courage, but with organization, that efficiency itself could become a form of strength. In every tank that rolled across Europe, in every plane that darkened the skies over the Pacific, there was a trace of that vision, a belief that human hands, guided by purpose and precision, could change the course of history. But Knudsen's legacy also carried a warning. The same blueprint that built liberty could, in other hands, build tyranny. The same systems that turned out Shermans could one day turn out missiles or drones. His life reminded the world that power once mastered demands conscience. In the decades after his death, the hum of American industry continued, in the suburbs, on assembly lines, in the dawn of the computer age. The war had ended, but the method endured. The dream of building better, faster, stronger became a permanent part of human ambition. And somewhere between the echo of hammer strikes and the whir of machinery, his spirit lingers. Not in marble statues or grand memorials, but in the pulse of every factory that still believes in the promise of creation. From the assembly lines of Detroit to the quiet halls of innovation today, Knudsen's lesson endures, that even in the darkest times, progress can be forged, not through destruction, but through design. He turned blueprints into victory. And in doing so, he proved that the greatest weapon of all was not the tank nor the gun, but the mind that dared to build them.